He thought she was just the housekeeper, until the moment he found the photo that shattered everything he believed about his past. It was hidden behind a dusty cookbook, its edges curled with time, showing a young woman he barely recognized, standing beside him, smiling, and holding a child with his eyes. His breath caught in his throat, the world spinning around him. For years he'd lived inside the walls of his grief, convinced his family had vanished in that crash. But here in his own kitchen was proof that his past had never really died. It had just been quietly dusting his shelves, washing his plates, and carrying secrets too heavy to speak. And as her footsteps echoed down the hall, he knew that what he'd uncovered wasn't just a photo. It was the beginning of an unraveling that would tear open every wound he thought had healed. That night, the house felt heavier than ever. Neither spoke a word. He could hear her washing dishes in the kitchen, her movements careful, almost rehearsed. Every sound, the running water, the soft clink of glass, was a reminder that a stranger had been living among his ghosts. He sat in his study, staring at the photo on his desk, tracing the outlines of the faces he once loved, wondering how much of his own life had been rewritten without him noticing. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the child's face, those same green eyes staring back at him. He wondered if grief had played tricks on him, or if the world had lied in ways he never imagined. Somewhere in the house she was awake too, folding clothes, pretending nothing had changed. Morning arrived with the sound of gulls and the smell of salt. He avoided her eyes at breakfast. She poured coffee, steady hands hiding the storm inside. Every glance between them was a question, and every silence an answer neither dared to voice. When she finally left for town, he stood at the window watching her walk down the gravel path. The sea wind lifted her hair, and for a fleeting second he saw the woman in the photo. Younger, freer, smiling. Something inside him cracked open. The truth wasn't done with him yet. He waited until evening to confront her. The house smelled of lemon polish and sea air, but beneath it was tension thick enough to taste. He placed the photograph on the kitchen table and waited. When she entered, her face froze. Not in guilt, but in sorrow, as if she'd been preparing for this day her entire life. He asked where she got it. She said it was nothing, just an old picture left behind by a former employer. But he knew her eyes. Those trembling, wet eyes could never lie that well. The air between them felt like glass, one word away from shattering. Her voice was calm, too calm. She said she didn't know who they were. He asked again, softer this time. She looked at him as if searching for the man she used to know, or perhaps hoping he wouldn't remember. For a moment, the sound of the waves outside filled the silence, each crash marking the space between truth and denial. He almost believed her. Almost. After she left the room, he stayed where he was, staring at the photograph. He traced the child's face with his fingertip. The curve of the cheek, the eyes so much like his own. Memory fought with reason. He remembered the crash, the headlines, the funeral that felt too quiet. He remembered nothing of a child surviving. Could grief have blinded him so completely? That night, he couldn't sleep. The sea outside roared louder than usual, wind battering the windows like restless ghosts. He stood by the window, watching the storm roll in, replaying every moment of the past day. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked. He thought of her, how she always closed every window before bed, how she moved silently like someone afraid to be seen. The next morning, she pretended everything was normal. She cooked breakfast, hummed softly, and avoided his eyes. He sat in silence, studying her every movement, the way she stirred the coffee, the rhythm of her steps. Each detail mirrored his late wife's habits so perfectly it made his chest ache. And when she placed the cup before him, her hand brushed his. It was a touch full of memory and distance, both haunting and familiar. He couldn't let it go. The photograph haunted him like a whisper in the walls. Each time he tried to work, his thoughts drifted back to the boy's face, to her eyes. He searched the house for anything that didn't belong, finding traces of a life hidden in plain sight. A child's drawing behind a cabinet, a box of seashells in the pantry, a faded note with his late wife's handwriting. The more he found, the more the truth clawed at him. And when he finally opened her small bedroom door, the air smelled like salt and memory, and something too human to ignore. Her voice broke when she told him to leave her things alone. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He simply asked one question. Who was the boy? She turned away, her hand clutching the doorframe for balance. For a heartbeat, she almost answered. Then she said the boy was gone. Her tone was final, but her trembling betrayed her. The lie hung in the air like smoke neither could breathe through. When she left for the market that afternoon, he followed the thread of doubt. He drove into town, heart-pounding, chasing ghosts of the past. He found the old hospital records buried in dusty archives, a single entry that froze his blood. Infant male, condition stable, mother deceased, guardian, name withheld. His world tilted. For years he had mourned a child who never died. Driving home through the rain, his hands trembled on the steering wheel. Every drop that hit the windshield echoed the beating of his heart. The road ahead blurred through tears he didn't notice falling. All those years, he had believed in loss. Now, he was staring at betrayal. But whose? Hers? Hers, or his own, for never asking enough questions when it mattered. When he returned, the house was dark except for one lamp in the kitchen. She sat at the table, waiting, as if she knew he'd found something. Neither spoke. He placed the hospital file beside the photo. She looked at both, then at him, her expression breaking open. For a long moment, the sea outside howled, and everything between them cracked like glass. The fracture had begun, and there was no mending it without blood. The storm hit just as their words did. Lightning cut through the sky, and thunder drowned out restraint. She stood before him, shaking, her voice breaking through the roar of rain. He demanded to know everything. Who the boy was, where he'd gone, why she'd lied. She told him she'd done what she had to. He called it betrayal. She called it mercy. For the first time, their silence shattered, and the truth began to crawl out from the years it had been buried under. She told him the truth like confession and punishment all at once. His wife hadn't died immediately. She'd lingered for days in the hospital, whispering her last wishes. She'd asked Mara, her caretaker, to protect their child, to take him far away until Thomas could face life again. But Thomas never came. He drowned himself in work, in grief, in pretending that love had died with her. Mara raised the boy in silence, fearing the day she'd have to hand him back. He couldn't speak. The truth hit harder than any loss had known. He remembered the nurse who told him the baby hadn't survived. The paperwork had signed without reading. The numbness had mistaken for closure. His wife had trusted him with life, and he had turned away. Every breath now felt like penance. He looked at Mara and saw not betrayal, but the unbearable weight she had carried alone. She whispered that the boy's name was Evan. He had grown into a kind, quiet young man, their son in every way that mattered. He lived only a few towns away, never knowing who his real father was. She said she had planned to tell Thomas, but each time she saw his emptiness, she lost the courage. How could I take away the one thing that kept me alive too? She said. And he finally understood. This wasn't a story about lies. It was about survival. He rose from his chair, the floor creaking beneath his weight. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just stood there, staring at the woman who had saved his son, and maybe, in her own quiet way, saved him too. Where is he now? He asked. Her voice trembled when she answered, close enough to find if you still want to. Outside, the storm began to ease, and for the first time in years, he felt something break open inside him. Something that sounded like hope. The morning after the storm, silence filled the house like fog. He couldn't look at her without seeing all the years he'd lost, the birthdays he'd missed, the laughter he never heard. She moved quietly, making tea as if it could undo what had been said. But he saw the fatigue in her shoulders, the years of sacrifice carved into her hands, guilt pressed on his chest like weight he could never lift. He realized she had spent decades doing what he should have done, loving his son when he couldn't. He spent the day walking the beach alone, the cold wind cutting through his clothes. Every crashing wave seemed to whisper the same word. Why? He had built houses for strangers, designed skylines for cities, yet failed to build a home for his own child. He remembered the day his wife died, how quickly he'd let his grief swallow everything good left in him. He wanted to hate Mara for keeping the truth, but all he could feel was shame for never being the kind of man she could trust with it. Back at the house, he found her cleaning again. Not because it needed it, but because that's what she did when she was afraid. He told her he had no right to ask forgiveness. She said forgiveness wasn't hers to give. It belonged to the boy who grew up without his father's face. The words hit him harder than the storm ever had. He wanted to scream, to beg, but all he could do was whisper. "Where can I find him?" She gave him an address written on an old piece of paper. He held it like something sacred, terrified it would dissolve if he breathed too hard. His hands shook as he read the name. Evan Ross. Not Evan Miles, not his name. The realization stung, but he understood. She'd given the boy a new life, a clean slate untainted by his father's grief. As he folded the paper, she looked at him and said, "He's not ready to meet you yet, but maybe you can be ready for him." That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the sea until dawn, listening to the waves breathe in and out like confession. He thought of the boy, of his smile in the photo, of all the years he'd been alive while his father lived as though dead. For the first time in his life, Thomas prayed, not for forgiveness, but for the chance to be worthy of it. And somewhere inside that endless gray horizon, the guilt began to loosen its hold, replaced by something fragile and trembling. Courage. The next morning he drove for hours along the winding coastal road, the paper with Evan's address clenched in his fist. Every mile felt heavier than the last. He imagined the face of a young man he'd never met, the sound of a voice that carried his blood but not his memories. Doubt whispered that it was too late. But the image of Mara's trembling eyes pushed him forward. Some truths couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, they could be met halfway. He found the small town easily, a place of weathered docks and children playing near the shore. When he saw the workshop with E. Ross Boat Repair painted on the door, his heart stopped. Through the open window he caught sight of him, broad-shouldered, focused, with that same half-smile his late wife used to wear. For a long moment, Thomas just watched, feeling both proud and unworthy. He'd missed every chapter of his son's life, yet the story wasn't over. Not if he had the courage to turn the page. He introduced himself only as a man passing through, asking for small talk, where the sea was calmest, how long Evan had lived here. The young man answered politely, unaware of the storm behind the stranger's calm voice. Each word was a test of restraint. Thomas wanted to tell him everything, to say I'm your father, to beg for the years he'd lost. But fear rooted him in silence. He realized that truth, like love, had to be earned. Before leaving, Thomas placed a small envelope on the counter. Inside was the old family photo, carefully flattened, its edges still curled from time. He didn't stay to see Evan open it. As he walked out, he heard the faint sound of silence breaking. A breath caught, a chair scraping the floor, footsteps following him out the door. He turned, and in that single look between them, The truth passed wordlessly from father to son. They met again by the docks that evening. No questions, no explanations, just the two of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching the tide roll in. Evan's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "She told me you were lost." Thomas swallowed hard. "She saved you," he said. The younger man nodded. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind that mends things, the kind that carries the weight of forgiveness without needing the words. A week passed before Thomas returned to the seaside house. The ocean was calm again, the air scented with salt and renewal. Mara was in the garden, trimming the roses she'd planted years ago, the same ones his wife once loved. When she looked up and saw him, her face softened, but her eyes stayed guarded. He didn't need to say where he'd been. She already knew. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, filled with everything that didn't need to be spoken. He told her he'd found Evan, that the boy was grown, strong, and kind. Her hands stopped moving, and for a moment her eyes shimmered. "Did he hate me?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. He just wanted to know why love had to hide. Mara smiled faintly, her lips trembling, her eyes glistening in the sunlight. "Because sometimes," she whispered, "love survives only when it hides long enough to heal." That evening, the three of them sat together for the first time. Not as employer, stranger, and secret, but as a family rediscovering itself. The table was simple. Bread, soup, laughter, in small pieces. Evan spoke little, but his presence filled the room like warmth. When he smiled, Mara's eyes filled with quiet tears. Thomas looked at them both and realized something he never thought he'd feel again. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of understanding. Later, as the others slept, Thomas stood on the porch overlooking the waves. He thought about all the years that had vanished and how the world had quietly kept turning anyway. Grief had taken his past, but truth had given him back his future. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Mara's voice soft in the night air. "Should be proud of you." He didn't turn around. He just nodded, eyes glistening, as the stars reflected off the sea like 1,000 small second chances. At sunrise, the three stood by the shore together. The water was calm, the air cool and full of light. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out the old photograph, now flattened, restored, no longer hidden. He handed it to Evan, who smiled before letting the sea breeze take it from his hand. The photo drifted into the water and floated away, the past finally set free. They watched it sink beneath the morning light, not as loss, but as release. For the first time in decades, the tide carried peace instead of pain.